underground drug culture, the heroin culture in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tulsa, heroin culture. You got Larry Clark right there. All right. I think, yeah, Graziella Tabide did not make the list. All right, Sebastião Salgado, Brazilian photographer, started out in finance for the World Bank, but then eventually, after seeing many of these places and the impoverished workers of the world, he switched over to photography. Beautiful documentary photographs. I'll show you the Sierra Palo, I gotta say that wrong, Sierra Pelada? Some gold mine in Brazil. But you know, the world's largest gold mine in Brazil. He'll show you this famine in Ethiopia. Basically the poorest people of the world, but his aesthetic, his composition is so classic. It's almost like he aestheticizes these images of poor people. Kudelka probably is not on the list. No. Alright, Hiroshi Tsukamoto. I don't think on the list, but this is what Colin was referring to. I mean, this is the same photographer, so he has the other typology of the seascapes. So even though Tsukamoto isn't necessarily on the exam, just that idea of the typology that I had you write down, this is an example of it, okay? So the Beckers, we have all the industrial structures, it's always the same structure, it's put in a grid, so even though everything is photographed in the exact same lighting conditions, very matter-of-factly, you're supposed to notice the little differences because of that typology. So here, a typology, it's any kind of classification system. Things really easily fit into a group. So Tsukamoto did this a lot, so here it's the movie theaters. It's always the same subject matter, over and over again. One typology. But the differences are the actual theaters, the kind of other differences in the seating, all those little things that you're going to discover because everything else is presented in such a routine grid-like format. So just really want to hammer home that idea of the typology. And then Philip Halsman, portrait photographer. This is, it's really going to be Arnold Newman with the idea of the environmental portrait, but Philippe Halsman has all these images of Salvador Dali, so they're like environmental portraits where the background, the props, everything in the scene is supposed to tell you something about the character or the person, the portrait part of it. So the crazy surreal work of Dali, this image, Dali Atomicus, you kind of see the way that the photograph mimics the personality and the art of the great artist. And then Arnold Newman, definitely associated with the idea of the environmental portrait. He's the father of environmental portraiture. So Arnold Newman, a lot of celebrities, a lot of artists, important figures, but he always finds a way to tell you a lot about them with the minimal kind of means. So here, Stravinsky, great avant-garde composer, he's at the piano where he composes. The piano makes the shape of a music note, and even the three tones, the black, the middle gray, and the white, it kind of references the minimalistic chords that Stravinsky used in his work. So just using all those means of the picture to tell you more about the individual. Okay. And then, okay, I'm going to put the lights on. I know there's a bunch of names and everything. Alright, so let me just go through and make sure nobody else got left out. Okay, so social scene. I did not talk about John Thompson. John Thompson, mainly images of China. So he's a British photographer, but a lot of images of China before China had people like Yvonne Lei kind of opening up their own businesses. But mainly street life and everyday life in China.
That was Thompson's.
John Thompson at the top.
There won't be any pictures, so we have to know exactly.
So there are no images from the text that you need to memorize. John Thompson, name of image, year, process. There are no images like that. But you still need to be able to, hey, that's a Walker Evans, and I can identify that by saying, fill in the blank, Walker Evans. Or, hey, there's a list of names, and I can kind of connect the dots. So there will be that image identified, but like last time, unless the image is in the book, it's not going to be one of the other pictures that I showed you from the lecture. It has to be one of the images in the book.
So much chance you could narrow down which ones might have picture identifiers, was there?
No way.
Okay.
But again, you don't have to memorize the titles. But it'll be easier if I give you the name of like a Walker Evans and you got to connect the dot, of course, than like fill in, but it's kind of the way it goes. All right, so Reese, Heim, Margaret Bourke-White, I showed you the life cover, but you know, just important industrial photographer. James Van Der Zee. So if there's an image in the text, even though I didn't show an image here, if there is an image in the text, it could still pop up, okay? But James Van Der Zee, but their name has to be on here. I just want to clarify that. Yeah, like so if there was an image in the book of a name I did not talk about, it's okay. All right? All right, so James Van Der Zee, he was really a commercial photographer from Harlem, New York, but in a somewhat documentary fashion, we look back at his work as giving us kind of a glimpse into that culture in that time period. So it's mainly 1920s and 30s Harlem, New York. The halftone, I referenced this with Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. This is the first publication to use halftone, but you know, it's like that newspaper format where the more that the dots collect next to each other, you get a darker tone. The more that they break away, you get a lighter tone. But even though it's just all those dots, it gives you the illusion of continuous grayscale. So just, really, I need you to connect it to just the idea of Jacob Riis used in that book, How the Other Half Lives. And then these dates should seem familiar. I don't list the 1888, but put that in there. So 1878, you have dry plate collodion. So it's still a glass plate, but you don't need to coat it in the field. 1883, celluloid or plastic kind of emulsion film. So this is really even less fragile and more mobile. And then 1888, Kodak hand camera. So we mainly talked about that stuff with pictorialism because like a year after the Kodak hand camera, you have, you know, like you have snapshot photography because of the Kodak hand camera, and then you have pictorialism a year later as a reaction.
The Solomon camera, was that the plates or?
That was a single glass plate, 2 by 3 inches, but that's like in the 20s.
No cellular.
No, it's not cellular.
Okay.
Yeah, but that I think I put with. Well, we'll get to Solomon. Yeah, just remember the name of his camera is the Uranox.
But that was a small little.
But it's a 2 by 3 glass plate, right. And usually it's 1/25th of a second, so usually need to be on like a monopod or tripod thing. All right, and then we went through Evans, Lang, and Rothstein. Man Ray, John Hartfield, Marchenko, Kertész. I know there's an image by Kertész in the text. Kertész, 35mm Leica. You know, used that small format camera a lot. He did a lot of editorial work. Paul Strand. He was kind of the same circle as, you know, Edward Steichen, Alfred Stieglitz, Dorothea Lange. So very strong modernist photographer, very abstract. He did the whole thing with, you know, making the hidden camera so he could make the image of the blind woman. Sheeler talked about Weston Cunningham Adams you got for F64. And like precisionism, F64, New Sacklichkeit, even though they're their own things, they all kind of represent the same basic idea, which is like using photographic qualities, the mimetic, the copying function of photography, its mechanical functions, using those things to show the modern world.
How was different?
Well, the New Sacklichkeit is specifically German. And it's about them kind of making these very formal abstract pictures, whether it's industry or it's organic stuff. It's just this very practical, objective look at the world. But August Sander is part of New Sacklichkeit, the new practicality, new objectivity. F64 is basically the American West Coast with Weston, Cunningham, and Adams. So even though they're more like wilderness and wild subjects, it's the West Coast version of precisionism, which is basically an American movement about industry. So like, even when you look at these paintings of precisionism of industry, super geometric planes, geometric lines, like sharp focus, stuff like that.
That's why Adams goes to Stieglitz, right? Like, the part of the same.
It's kind of all part of the same thing, but I mean, they're their own different thing. But I mean, he goes to see Stieglitz because Stieglitz is the biggest guy in New York.
But he was part of the
Stieglitz,
precisionism in a sense.
Kind of, I mean, like, you could call some of Stieglitz's work precisionism. Like, even if you look at early George O'Keeffe, She has these pictures of Manhattan. They're all like buildings without windows on them, and they're very like abstract. She was part of Precisionism. But Precisionism, industrial subjects. F-64, very specifically photography and those West Coast people, and you know what they were working with. All right, Eric Sullivan, Life, just it was this golden age of the picture magazine, and if anything, just connect Margaret Bourke-White to that first cover of Life magazine. Magnum we talked about, so the 3 people on this list, there were 4 originally, who set up Magnum, but Chim, that's his like AKA name, and David Seymour, Robert Capa, and Henri Cartier-Bresson, those are the 3 people associated with Magnum. Joanneau we talked about, Ouija, Abaddon. Family of Man was that 1955 Museum of Modern Art exhibition that was curated by Edward Steichen. It was coming off of World War II. It was an attempt to kind of unify humanity. Take all these different pictures from all over the world, all these different subjects, but coming off of that global conflict, it was an attempt to try to like connect the loose threads and show that we're all connected as a global culture.
Who did that, Jim?
The curator was Edward Steichen.
What year was it?
1955.
55.
Oh, yeah. Okay, we went over the concept of the straight image. Callahan, Siskin, White. I can't believe I didn't show you any Robert Frank, but that's because I showed you the book. So Robert Frank, the book, The Americans, 35mm street photography. He's a Swiss Jewish intellectual. So at first, when Americans see this book, it seems very kind of confrontational. They're not used to seeing this vision of their society. But Robert Frank, The Americans, 35mm, I think if you got that, you're going to be pretty good. D.A. Arbus we talked about, Winogrand, Muriel Mark, Salgado, Clark. Susan Meisalas, important documentary photojournalistic photographer. The 2 projects that I really referenced a lot here were Carnival Strippers and her Nicaragua project, where she went down to Nicaragua during the Civil War and she documented it.
So the Nicaraguan one?
The 2 projects?
Yeah.
Yeah, Nicaragua and then Carnival Strippers.
It's just called Nicaragua.
Yeah. Alright, and then new topographics. But I can't say.
That's the essay, one of the 2.
What's that?
The essay will be based on one of the 2. The essay and the test will be based on one of these 2 graphs, you said?
What is the other thing I'm missing? Topographics and what?
Social landscape.
Oh, I see
No.
what you mean. I missed it.
Okay, no. I mean, I was just trying to figure out if I should even go into this right now. But new topographics, it was just that movement. I mean, the Beckers with all the industrial water towers, that's a typology, but they're actually technically part of new topographics. It's a lot of very matter-of-fact images from the 1960s on that almost look artless. Like, you don't look at them and like, oh God, that's a beautiful picture, the composition is perfect. It's mainly about like, okay, let me as the viewer make up my own interpretation of the image. So like all the people we saw, like Louis Baltz and Robert Adams, they seem kind of like boring photographs, but it's pictures of like, LA moving out into the desert, or all the condominiums that are being built outside of Denver. It's very matter of fact because it's supposed to make us think. So topography is map making or, like charting somewhere. So just that idea of like kind of banal, boring pictures, but they're made to make the viewer think about the world that's out there being photographed. So I'm giving you that big description, but I don't think you have to worry a ridiculous amount about new topographics. So you don't need to know any of the specific new topographics photographers. Sally Mann went over, Halsman, Newman went over. And then I'll go over these people. I didn't include these in the summary images. Joel Meyerowitz, color, 8x10. The big project is called Cape Light. So it's all pictures of Cape Cod. It's really a formal study of the nature of light. He's also a street photographer, which he does all 35, but really for our purposes, the Cape Light series. Dwayne Michaels, the idea of the photo sequence. So using images in pairs or in a group to tell you a story. But usually they're kind of philosophical or they're whimsical. but we still